Well, welcome back to Classic Working Vehicles. We're carrying on with the 421, the Unimog 421 restoration, and the last couple of episodes we've been doing a lot of work on the cab, on the bodywork. Now that's basically done, I'm going to turn my attention back to mechanical jobs. There's a few things I picked up from checking the vehicle over before I disassembled it. Gearbox we need to look at. As far as I know it's basically working, but there's a couple of seals I want to replace. And on the back axle I discovered the diff lock wasn't working, so I want to investigate what's going on there and see if I can fix it. So it's worth maybe having a bit of a look at the layout of the axles on the Unimog. They are a bit unusual. They use this thing, sometimes it's called the torque tube or the thrust tube, but basically what's going on here is that the prop shaft that goes to the differential to drive the rear wheels, and similarly on the front wheels, it's enclosed in this tube. Now not only does that mean that all the road muck, dirt, or more importantly if you're off-roading, all the muck there actually doesn't contaminate the drive shaft, so it doesn't go into the universal joints and so on. It's all sealed, so it has that advantage, but actually from an engineering point of view it does more than that. It's also where all the thrust, if you imagine the axles are what's pushing the vehicle along, and all that thrust is pushed up through this tube, through a kind of a ball coupling here, and actually through the back of the transmission. And there's one cross member that all of that thrust and pull force as well from the front axle goes through, and then everything else on the chassis twists around that. So it's quite a clever and rather unusual system. And as well as that, the axles are what are known as portal axles. The centre of the hub is not at the centre of the axle, it's actually lower. And that does two things. It increases ground clearance underneath the differential housing, great for off-road, but it also means there's a gear reduction in the end of the axle here. So you can have a smaller differential for a given torque output because of the gearing down that goes on in the portal, the little drop-down gearbox that's in the end of the axles. Now these are reliable generally, not least because they are fully enclosed, but there are a few things that can give trouble on, to some extent, all Unimog axles, particularly of this period or when they get to this sort of age. So down this thrust tube there's a couple of smaller pipes running. One of them is the brake line that splits here and goes to the wheel cylinders for the drum brakes, which we'll have a look at in due course. And this larger bore pipe is what controls the differential lock that's inside the axle tube here, which is the bit we need to get at. There was an option on the 421 to either have your diff lock air operated, or you could have it hydraulically operated. And the system, in terms of pipes and feeds and things, was the same. You can see here it's pretty grubby, but there's a bleed nipple here. Now when this is air operated, obviously you don't need to bleed the system, but when it's hydraulically operated, this would be full of oil. You need to get the air out of the system. It would be a bit like a brake system. There's a cylinder that moves up and down inside the axle here. It's a sleeved cylinder, or sleeved piston, I should say. So that's so you can bleed the system when it's hydraulically operated, so using oil. And the versions of the 421 that used oil were usually the ones that didn't have a compressed air system. The compressed air system was an option on the models. If they did have a compressed air system, generally they would have the air-operated diff lock, which is great, it's very effective. The downside is, like all compressed air systems, it produces moisture in the system, and that moisture will lead to corrosion. So often in Unimogs, the diff locks suffer quite badly from corrosion because of the moisture that gets into the system. And if they're not used very often or they're stood for a long time, that water, that moisture can sit in there and obviously it will rust and it leads to things seizing. So I suspect we've got a very rusty diff lock at this end. Won't really know until we take it apart. So more modern trucks tend to have what's called an air dryer to try and take out the condensation out of the compressed air system. So I noticed when I was experimenting with the diff lock, see if I could get it to work, that I could hear air leaking out of this steel pipe, and sure enough, don't know if you can see on camera, but there's a hole there, and that was under one of the clamps. Obviously moisture's got trapped there and it's corroded through, so that'll either need repairing or probably more likely just replacement. So this is the fitting that the airline goes onto, which I've already loosened off, but let's take this out, have a look at it. So it does a couple of things. Not only does it allow to connect the air system or the hydraulic system, depending on which version it's using, but this pipe that extends out also serves as the guide for the piston inside here. It runs up and down inside a slot, which we'll see when we take it all apart. So I'm going to put that back temporarily, and I'm just going to put some air pressure in here and just see whether the piston in there moves at all. It's probably going to spray some oil because I've put some WD-40 down in there to try and help it. Now if it's moving, we should hear a clunk. But nothing's happening there, so it's seized. So we need to take off this part of the axle. So to get at that, we need to take off this half of the axle, what's called the trumpet. So we'll have to undo these bolts around the diff housing. Support this, it's pretty heavy. And there's this A-frame bar that we need to take out as well. And the brake line and a handbrake feed or handbrake cable as well. And then we should be able to remove this. It'll expose the diff, or certainly the crown wheel of the diff, but we should be able to see inside the diff lock and see what's going on. Okay, well, I just want to take the weight of this half of the axle, the trumpet. I'm lucky enough to have an overhead crane, but an engine hoist would do much the same job. You can lift it with a couple of people, but you've obviously got more control with a mechanical lifting device, and I'm working by myself as well. So next job is completely undo these bolts. That's it, it's off. Let's just have a look at what it reveals. So we've got the back face of the ground gear here inside the differential. That's the bearing it runs on. And this castellated shaft here is one half of the diff lock. The other half is here. So we have a big spring which pushes the diff lock out of mesh. And then this castellated area, or this castellated shaft, is what slides forward under air pressure. This is really a piston and engages with this one, and that's what locks up the diff. So it all looks pretty nice and clean in here, it has to be said. Bearing surface at first glance looks good, no corrosion. But this is not moving, so I need to try and get this out and see what's going on. So I've left the diff lock soaking in WD-40 overnight, and I put in a bit of rubber hose here in an attempt to get an airtight seal, and I'm just going to see whether I can blow the diff lock piston out. I think it's unlikely, but it's worth trying, because if I can't blow it out, what I've got to do is dismantle the hub, be able to get the half shaft out, to be able to get it in. So we'll give it a quick go. No sign of any movement. So just to make this a bit more stable, I'm going to temporarily bolt it back onto the diff housing, just with a couple of bolts, and then I can start to take the drum off and dismantle the hub with a view to getting the half shaft out. So that's all come apart pretty well. Wheel cylinder, pull back the rubbles on there, they're pretty corroded, so they're either going to need overhaul or replacement. But the brake shoes look fantastic. It doesn't smell burnt or anything like that. This seal looks good. But now we've got the half shaft out of this end, what I can hopefully do is now look at getting that diff lock piston out of there. So I'm using a slide hammer to be able to pull the sleeved piston back out the axle tube. There we go. So with access and the right tools, removing it's not too bad. So there is corrosion on this, but actually on the surface where there's close tolerances, it's really not too bad. So I'm a bit intrigued as to why it's seized. So I'll have a look inside the axle tube and try inside the trumpet and see if we can see what's going on. I'm quite pleased with that. So as we look inside the axle trumpet, there is indeed, if you can see that, quite a bit of corrosion in there. And I think that's our problem. So I need to try and clean that out and probably hone this out, get a nice smooth surface on it. But I think it will come back. We'll replace the seal on the piston as a matter of course. But hopefully this will live to fight another day. All is looking good basically. We're looking down inside the axle trumpet here. The polished surface is the surface that the sealing ring on the diff lock runs over after a clean-up. The pitted surface you can see behind it is just the air void where the air pressure sits to push the piston. You can see a seal there. That's the original seal that I haven't taken out yet, but I will replace that. And then if we have a look at the piston itself, which I've cleaned up, that's looking really good. Again, the seal runs over this surface here where I'm running my finger. Little bit of scoring on it, but that won't affect its ability to slide, and you might lose a little bit of air through it, but it'll be very little. Again, I'll put a new seal in here, so that's all cleaned up beautifully. So it's sliding backwards and forwards, or up and down at the moment. So I'm pretty confident it's going to work. it's all reassembled now, and what I want to do, just using the workshop airline, is simulate the diff lock being engaged. So I've put a bit of rubber pipe on here just to try and reduce the amount of air that escapes, and if it is working we should hear a clunk of it engaging and disengaging. Brilliant, that's working. So you can hear it click engage, and then the spring is what disengages it. So the real test is whether we can make the back axle basically a solid axle with the diff lock being engaged. So if I turn this one hub with it disengaged, the opposite wheel is going in the reverse direction, which is typical of a diff, and it's not connected to anything at the gearbox end. But when I put some air pressure in there, what should happen is they should both rotate the same, and there'll be a bit more resistance to do that, I expect. You can see both ends on camera, but they're both rotating together. I take the air pressure off, it disengages. So, seems to be fixed. It's all working as it should. Well, with the diff lock working, we can call that fixed. Next job will be to steam clean it and just generally clean up the axle, ready for paint. But I think we'll cover that in a later episode, along with a range of other jobs that are coming up. Anyway, I hope the repair has been interesting to watch. If you're enjoying the channel and you like the content, I know you're all sick of hearing this on YouTube, but it really does help with creators if you give a thumbs up, and even better, subscribe as well. And it keeps me motivating and wanting to put up new content. So if you haven't done that, please do if you're enjoying what I'm doing. Anyway, next episode I suspect we'll be looking at the gearbox a bit more. I need to check over the front axle, and then once we've got them cleaned up and painted, we'll actually be starting to reassemble things. So see you next time.